So today I'm going to be
You're
talking
set?
to folks about learning techniques and this notion of what works and what doesn't. So I'm at the University of Toronto. I'm a PhD candidate. So I look at things from a very, very heavily research-oriented lens, and I'm going to share that lens with you today. And before I begin, I want to talk about what is learning. So that's the one big theme that's bringing us all together here. And surprisingly, it's a lot harder to define this very generic term that we use on an ongoing basis. And it's a really complex, multidimensional thought. And from major learning theories, from behaviorism to cognitivism to social constructivism to humanism to digital humanism, and so many have tried to define it, and they're all right in their own way. So I'm going to share the couple of definitions that I align for this particular discussion today with you. And the first definition I really, really like is learning is a change in one's long-term memory. So it's a very psychological, very sort of mental, cognitive definition. It's this idea that the change is happening in one's long-term memory. It's from Paul Kirschner and Carl Hendrick, and I'm a big, big fan of their work, their research, and their view on how learning actually happens. Another definition that I think can really help us understand and get into this discussion today is learning is a process that leads to change, which occurs as a result of experience and increases the potential for improved performance and future learning. So you notice the three words that I put out in orange there. One of them is it's a process, it's not a product. It leads to some kind of change, and that change can be in the form of behavior, attitude, impact, abilities, skills. It's really complex, and it happens as a result of an experience that we go through. So when you go through a microlearning experience, that creates a change in us, and hopefully the idea is that we are achieving long-term retention and memory and learning. So a couple of definitions I wanted to share. And again, these are not the only definitions of learning. Learning is, as I said, complex, multidimensional, really, really deep to define. But for our discussion today, these two will guide us nicely. Now, the question is, I think I skipped a slide. Sorry, sorry. Yeah. So the question is, how can we as learners, and I'm not just saying as educators, as learners or educators during this process of change, facilitate effective long-term learning? Because if you think about that idea of change in the long-term memory, we want learning to stick, right? Learning should happen for the reason that we should be able to access it from our brain when we need it, because not everything we can look it up, right? So what can we do as learners or as educators? And I really want you to think about as learners also, because you are really an active member, active sort of entity in the process of learning. What can you do to and sort of make sure that long-term knowledge acquisition is taking place? So what I would like you to do is, I know folks are already typing in the chat, but I'm not following it just yet, but type in chat, what are some of your chosen learning techniques that you incorporate on a regular basis? I'll give you about 15 or so seconds. So type in what do you think, what do you do, how to make sure that learning is going to stick when you sit down with some new material. Flashcards, snackable content, infographics, modeling. I'm trying to read, it's going really, really fast. That's awesome. Storytelling, formative assessment, scenarios, chunking. Okay, wow, it's faster than I can read, but that's exciting. That's really great. It means folks are listening and we're sharing. Practical application, reinforcement, examples, great. Gamification, yes, perfect. And feel free to share some exactly emojis as well. Okay, so thank you. You can keep going if you want to continue sharing, but those are really, really great ideas. I love the one, link to prior knowledge to build connections. Thank you. Cognitive. Awesome. So now let's see what does the research say. So we all have our little ways of making learning stick. We have our ways of doing things that is like, this is how I learn and this is how I make sure, or hopefully try that it would stick in my brain and I can access it when I need. But what does the research say? I mentioned I'm a researcher, I looked at things through a very, very critical lens. So this is something I'd like to share with you. So so what we want to understand today is what works and what doesn't, right? In terms of learning techniques, because we don't want to be spending so much time on techniques that are not effective and missing out on the amazing techniques that may get a bad rep because of the way they are labeled, they're titled, or we may be a bit intimidated by their bigger names, right? So let's look at it. Now, the question that I'm really interested in, or many people are, is study techniques and their effectiveness. So some techniques are accelerating learning and they can accelerate to do that, while others are just a waste of time. But the question is, which ones are which? And now here's the good news and here's the bad news. Huge amount of research is available. It's really good news, but it's all really bad news. Why? Because it's so much information. How do we know what's right, what's wrong? And especially research, by the time it reaches a classroom or by the time it reaches a sort of learning and development sort of experience, what happens to that research? And it's not always easy to read research papers. I read them on a regular basis and they're great, but not all of them are easily written in a language that speaks to me. And I'd be like, yeah, I can apply that in my next learning design. So it's overwhelming and it can be confusing, right? So a great group of folks, I think 5 or 6, Dinlowski et al. We're calling them, because there's Daniel Willingham in there, there's Rawson, there's 5 excellent cognitive psychologists and educational psychologists took this task, and they did something really, really amazing for us educators and for the field of education and learning back in 2013. It is about 9 years old, but to this date, it is one of the best reviews done, and I'll be sharing details about that review. What did they do? They took 700 scientific articles. Think about that. 700 scientific articles, and they made a list of 10 commonly used learning techniques, and they said, let's rate them based on these studies. This was empirical data. These were studies that were done on how students, learners performed in classroom, outside classroom, when they were tested later on, etc. 700. I'm not going to talk about the 700, but I'm going to talk about the 10 techniques they chose. Now, why did they choose these specific 10? Because there's so many, as we can see from the list over here, that everybody was popping in, which was amazing. They chose these 10 based on the ease of use and popularity. This seems to be the most popular and the most commonly used, easily used techniques that students were incorporating. So they decided to go with those. Okay, so I think that was really a wise decision. All right. So what were these? So I'm going to walk you through the 10 really briefly, because I want to be micro about it. And of course, if folks want to read this report, this article in detail, in my slides, I have hyperlinked it. So you should be able to get access to that later, or you can always connect with me and I will happily share that with you. So the first one was highlighting. Needs no introduction. You can see the image. You know what highlighting is. We've all done it. We all probably still do it. It's beautiful. It's cute. It's pretty. Lots of funny colors and fun colors, I should say. Neon, bright. Second one is imagery for text. So just the idea, when you look at the girl's picture, try to visualize sort of mental images of the text that you're listening to or you're reading. That's one of the other techniques that they realized that came up over and over in these 700 scientific articles. The other one was practice testing. I personally prefer the word retrieval practice because it doesn't have the word testing in it. Nothing wrong with testing, but I like the word retrieval practice, and it's a more encompassing also. It takes away the stress, right? Anxiety. The other fourth technique they looked at is rereading. We all reread. You have an exam, you memorize things, and just before the exam, you're like, oh, let me look at it again. And then that's rereading. We're all doing that. We all do it. Summarization was the fifth technique that they did that. It's not specific to how long the summary should be, but students and learners tend to use this technique quite often. When they read something, it's like, okay, here are the 5, 7, 10, whatever number of points that I'm going to be focusing on right now. So the next 5 techniques, let's look at them. The sixth technique was elaborative interrogation. So unlike the other first 5, elaborative interrogation requires a little bit of explanation, and I'll happily do that. Elaborative interrogation is, as the name indicates, interrogating someone, and so in this case, your own self, but with questions, not just the what question or the whether question, which has a yes or no, but really getting into the how and the why questions, right? So that's really, really how you would go deeper and establish sort of connections in your prior knowledge. The 7th technique was self-explanation. So again, looking at yourself in the mirror or not and explaining to yourself how this happened. And I remember doing that as a kid also, when I would study something from my biology textbook. It's like, okay, this is how it happened, and I'll explain it to myself. The 8th one is keyword mnemonics, and there's a mnemonic over there. If folks are wondering, those are the names of the planets. So my very educated mother just served us noodles. So we've all probably done some kind of mnemonics, and so that's another technique that students were using in those 700 articles. Distributed practice is the other one, which is also known as spaced practice, and some folks also call it spaced learning. Are folks having a problem hearing me?
No, I think some folks are having issues with
Okay.
their audio
Because I just
connection.
noticed
It's
in the
not
chat.
you. Don't worry, Nidhi.
Okay, good, awesome. So distributed practice is a really excellent technique as well, which basically says distribute your study sort of sittings over a bit of time. So repetition, take a break, and then distribute your learning basically. And then last technique they looked at is interleaving, and I love that picture over there. Because I love fruits, but I also love this idea is that mix it up, mix oranges with apples, mix it up. Basically, don't do the blocking kind of learning where you just learn one topic and then you just keep doing that. But their interleaving suggests that you want to mix and match, and apparently we'll find out if it's actually effective or not. So the 10 techniques that I wanted to briefly explain right now. Now, here's the question. What did they find in the review? Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do a real quick poll, and Christopher is going to help me do that. Christopher, could you launch question number 1 from the poll? So we're going to see what you think was the most effective learning technique. And just take your pick. Thank you, Christopher.
No problem. Poll is live, folks. Get your votes in before we close it. I feel like we should have a auctioneer voice, just reading these poll votes in real time.
Yeah. Loving it. And by the way, I didn't put them all 10 in there because A, I thought it would be too much to read, but B, the platform only allows for 6 options to be there. So, but I picked whatever came to my mind first. So I just wanted to be as honest as I could be. Okay, and I think we have a bunch of votes. Thank you. Could we launch the second question, Christopher?
Yes, we can.
Which learning technique do you think the researchers found to be least or not effective at all?
All right, here we go.
Thank you.
Boom. All right, everybody. Poll number 2. So if you thought you voted before, this is a separate poll. Don't get complacent.
Yeah, this one's talking about the thumbs down, not cool, not good, not effective, not a good use of our time.
I guess we'll see how closely people were paying attention.
Yep. Well, I haven't told the answer yet. This is really what folks think.
I know, but one is most effective, not effective. We'll see if people made sure they voted on the right one.
Got it. Okay, cool. Hey, poor highlighting. It's so pretty though. Thank you. Okay, cool. Maybe a couple more seconds and we can close this poll. Awesome. Great, thank you. Okay, great. Thank you, Christopher. So good to see. And I think what I saw was, I think distributed practice came in the top from what folks voted, and the least effective highlighting, I think, came in the top as being least effective, so to say. Okay, let's find out. Thank you. Thanks for that, Christopher. So let's see the results of the review.
All right, which one do you want first?
No,
we
were able to see them actually, so we're good. Were folks not able to see it?
Yeah, they could. Yeah, they could. I didn't know if you wanted me to pull them back up. Sorry.
No, that's okay. No, I don't. I want to share the actual results. So yes, the gold star winners, practice testing and distributed practice. And I believe practice testing was a little bit more effective than distributed practice. But here's the thing. More research has come out now that if you mix the two, you have this power combo. And some researchers have called them successive learning. It's amazing. So practice testing, which basically means quizzing yourself, gets high marks. So, test yourself. And again, as I said, the word testing may be intimidating for a lot of folks, for a lot of learners, based on sort of younger to older, depending, but it really had the most effective influence on learning. And we're talking about long-term learning, long-term knowledge acquisition, right? The second one, or along in the same line, the gold star winner was distributed practice, and you guessed it, absolutely right. For best results, space your learning practice. So good. Okay, let's see what were the second round, the runner-ups. And still awesome. So I used my thumbs up there. Elaborative interrogation, channel your inner 4-year-old. I have an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old and a year and a half old. And the 8-year-old is asking different kind of questions, but my 4-year-old still asks like, but what is this? Why? How? What? Hi. So really channel your inner 4-year-old. It helps us deeply engage with the content and build sort of these sort of semantic processing, deeper processing, connections, right? Self-explanation, explain it to yourself and make connection. They say if you want to learn something, teach it to yourself if you don't have a student. So that really, really helps. Interleaving, which is mix it up. I want to say one quick point about interleaving is that of all the learning techniques, I would say interleaving does happen to be one of the most misunderstood one in terms of how to apply that. It's a bit tricky, but again, this session is not about that. Simple words mix topics, not big wide subjects. So, but again, maybe one day we can talk a little bit more about interleaving as well. Okay, and what doesn't work? Yes, highlighting doesn't work. It's just really pretty. In fact, they found out that it's not just that it doesn't work, it actually focused the learning away from learning. It was actually quite detrimental. Students, learners were not able to focus on what they actually needed to focus, and they were just highlighting. Quick question, not to answer, but just in your mind. The last time you highlighted something, can you tell me what it was? Probably not, because we're not actively engaging with the content. Rereading is the same way. It has an illusion of that I know what I'm reading, and it's coming from my brain, but it's already there. It's not coming from your brain. So that's why to be able to put it back in our brain, we need to take it out. And hence, I'm not surprised that the practice testing is the clear gold standard winner. Okay. What about the other three? They didn't talk so much about that in the quick report, so I will also skim through it because now I want to move on to the next piece after this, which is what does this mean for us in microlearning, right? But what about the other three? They said that imagery, summarization, mnemonics, they do seem to work in certain contexts. So, for example, mnemonics really works in vocabulary building. If you're learning preposition or like lots of terms in the medical industry, it can help, but they can be really time consuming. Coming up with a perfect mnemonic, right, or summarization can be really challenging, but at the same time we don't know as learners sometimes how to summarize it effectively. That's a really, really technical skill, right? So we may be summarizing just the wrong point, so ultimately learning may or may not happen. And they also said that more evidence is needed. Now, this study was done in 2013, and there is more evidence that has come out. So, but I'm focusing more on the, as I said, the two big winners that really, really help us understand what we can do with it today. Okay, so now gold star winners and microlearning. What does that mean? The practice testing, quiz yourself, and distributed practice space your learning. What does that mean for microlearning? We're here in MicrolearningCONF, so we definitely want to talk about it. So here's an interesting thing. Now you notice that I've switched them and I have put distributed practice on the left because I want to talk about that first, and I've put retrieval practice and I've changed the word, and I'm not calling it practice testing. In the study it was called practice testing, but I want to use the word retrieval practice, and I'm putting it here. So what does that mean? So let's look at distributed practice or spaced practice. It is well positioned. Microlearning is well positioned for space practice through its digestible design. Well, it's non-overwhelming, it's quick and is easy to do relatively if it's designed really nicely. So space practice really works because microlearning, you can do that much faster, right? Where if you had to go through an entire 1 hour of an online lecture or something, it'd be tricky. But if it's like bite size, you can actually use the benefits of space practice. So really, really application based, right? Retrieval practice. Now, retrieval practice is like a star, I have to say. It's an absolute star. What it does is that it enriches microlearning. It enriches any learning content for that matter, and it adds the so-called interactions to the micro content or any content for that matter. How does it do it? You can do it so many different ways, simple ways, and we have that, for example, in 7TAPS as well. It offers sort of, the zero stakes, low stakes quizzes, self-testing quizzes, match the following, fill in the blanks. You can do it so many different ways. There are other ways to do that also, flashcards, brain dump, think, pair, share. There's so many different amazing techniques, and I have lots of information about it if anybody wants to know more about that. And I have lots of great resources, so definitely feel free to connect with me at the end. Last slide does have my contact information. So we can really enrich our microlearning experiences by thinking about the cognitive science that tells us that distributed practice, spaced practice, and retrieval practice really, really can enhance that learning and the learning that we want to stick, right? That's the point here. Okay, so I'd like to leave you with one of my really, really favorite quotes by John Sweller, who developed the cognitive load theory. And he said, without an understanding of the human cognitive architecture, instruction is blind. So it doesn't matter you're making instructional material in the micro learning content concept or e-learning, online learning, or any kind of learning or classroom learning. If we don't pay attention to how learning happens, then we're not going to be able to make sure that that learning is going to stick, right? And that's extremely important. So distributed practice, retrieval practice, they have huge amount of empirical evidence that supports them from cognitive science that they work, and we should just really make use of that, right? Awesome. And oh, this was the slide that I was talking about. Once you receive the PDF, this is the whole research paper that has about 50 pages. So if you don't want to read that, there's a much shorter 9-page version report, which you can absolutely access. And it's really nicely written. So yeah, that would be that. And thank you very much. If you have any questions, please do share with me right now if we have some time. If not, then you can email them to me or connect with me via LinkedIn or Twitter. I do like to share a lot of cognitive science research on my LinkedIn space, and I love connecting with everyone about that as well. So thank you.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. Let's get a round of emojis and kudos in the chat. I thought that was fantastic, especially hearing it from the research side of things. I think sometimes we don't always get that perspective. And one of the comments, I'm supposed to be watching comments. They move so fast. Sometimes it's hard to catch up. But hang on, where's this one? It keeps jumping around. Good grief, you folks. You're moving so quick. Anyway,
Yeah,
one said that it was
that
interesting that one of the ones that all the ones that stood out really had to do with kind of some sort of active role of the individual participating in something, actually applying that knowledge piece in there, which I think is just a critical component to that, is telling people to do something with it versus just actively putting more ones and zeros in your head. One question I had for you that was really interesting listening to you talk about this is, I think anybody in our industry is very familiar with the number of myths and just bad junk science that floats around and is stated as fact a lot of times. So first of all, my one question to you is, how do you see some of that stuff creeping in so that people, I mean, because some of the stuff is stated as though it's truth, and it's like, where is that coming from? So first of all, one, where do you think some of that comes from? And how do you recommend people kind of countering that or pushing back? Because I've seen people do it and be a total jackwagon about it. And I don't think that's terribly productive to just be snotty about it. It certainly doesn't work with senior stakeholders. But how do you recommend kind of influencing people to think a little bit differently about things where they may be actually believing junk science?
Yeah, thank you so much, Christopher, for that question, because it is a huge problem. We call them educational myths, neuromyths, edu myths, different kinds of sort of terminology for that, and it's a huge problem. So just to break it down, for folks probably know it already. If you're here, you probably already know it. Learning styles don't exist. Multitasking doesn't work. If you require brain to think at the same time on two things, our working memory cannot support it. Left brain, right brain, a whole bunch. So learning, educational myths is a huge challenge in the field of education and learning.
Yes.
And we are rife, sadly so, with it. And something comes up, someone says something, and there's a little bit of research, and sometimes there's no research. Like learning styles has no research, actually.
Yeah.
And it becomes a
So
trend.
does people have the attention span of a goldfish, right? That's
Yes.
another one that I've
No,
seen
it
float around.
doesn't.
Oh,
There's
people
so
can't
many.
focus
There's
for
so
more than six seconds.
we covered a whole topic called educational myths in our course as well, and so they don't exist, but they happen. And why do they happen is because I feel research is written in such a this is one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, but research is written in such a way that it's kept behind locked doors.
Yeah.
Right, when it doesn't reach the educators, instruction designers, people like you and me, the classroom folks, or instruction development folks, then how are we going to know? Then we read the stuff that comes to our attention, and it seems to work because we have a certain teaching philosophy, a learning philosophy, and it feels connected, and we say, this must be true. And so it
Yeah.
begins, right? And I say one thing to my grad students when I'm teaching them, and I say, well, this will never live in medical industry. I would never want a doctor to be like, well, I think it's going to work because I have this philosophy.
Right. I have this gut feeling that I think this might actually really work well. I would not want that person doing surgery on me.
And thankfully, they don't do that, right? The stakes are different, right? So we look at clinical trials, we look at this, we look at that, we look at over and over again longitudinal data and stuff like that. And then one drug is used on us. And, even getting the jabs, for example, it's there. So, but in the field of education, it starts happening and there's less control and there's more thinking and there's less of this overarching sort of thing. So that happens, and that's a problem. That's a big problem. Now, what do we do about it is that I always tell everyone is two things we can do. As researchers, I think we should put out content that is more accessible and approachable, that people can read and understand. I have this joke and I say, academics write this way in simple words, da, 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 da. And then the following sentence is the most incomprehensible sentence. It's like, what did you just say? And I'm an academic and I can't understand, and I speak good, relatively decent English. And I understand, like, for folks that don't speak English, which is where most of the content is published in. So we should write content that speaks in a simple way. And that's where one of the books that How Learning Happens has been written. And it's a fantastic way to bring these seminal articles that have been written in our education field, and they are simplified for us to understand.
Right.
Second thing is, as content developers, as educators, as learners, as humans, have the critical lens. Don't drop the critical lens. If something comes up and say, this is the next paradigm shift in education, watch, stop, pause, and be like, no, that's happened before and it's not going to happen. That was said before and never happened. So I would say those are two things that I say. And the more we'll talk about it, and I think this conference is another step in that direction where you raise that question and more folks have sort of aligned with that. So if you read something and be like, pause, question, and say, I'm going to pick up some studies and I'm going to explore. Don't drop that desire to study a little bit.
All right. So don't get your learning research from Facebook memes is a great first step. And then when trying to influence others, don't call them a jackwagon. Instead, maybe use common English that they might understand to help them understand what actually the research does say. So I love it. Thank you for that. That was one of the things that just immediately came to mind as I was listening to you. I really appreciate it. One more round of emojis for Nidhi. Thank you so much for being here and all of that awesome